Hi everyone, welcome to our next session. It's been an amazing and inspiring morning of long run stories. So thank you to all our members that have presented so far. Thank you so much to you all for joining. So hopefully this morning everyone has heard a little bit about our work here at the Long Run, or at least seen some of the results of that work. And a lot of it revolves around supporting our members with strategic sustainability planning. That means that we're ensuring that sustainability goals, vision, values are really embedded into all business activities. And this also lends itself very well to climate action planning, which is why we really wanted to delve into this topic a bit deeper in this panel discussion and have invited these experts to share their thoughts. So today, as a quick introduction, we've got Virginia Fernandez-Trapper, who's Programme Coordinator at UN Tourism. We've got Dr. Willy Legrand, Professor at IU, International University of Applied Sciences, and Jeremy Smith, who is co-author of the Glasgow Declaration on Climate Action in Tourism. So first of all, just to say that if anyone has any questions, and please drop them in the Q&A, because we've got some time for questions at the end. So we'll be going through those later on. And to kickstart, I was going to invite Virginia to give us a bit of an update about where things are at with the Glasgow Declaration, UN tourism in general, and maybe some exciting news about what's going on later this year.
Thank you so much, Holly, and hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. Thanks for inviting UN Tourism and for having us here. It's great to participate in the virtual show. We very much value the work that you do in the long run and the work that your members are doing. So it's fantastic to be here, and also great to have you as one of the signatories of the Glasgow Declaration. Now, I guess getting into your question, so maybe to share a bit of context with the colleagues connected today about the Glasgow Declaration. No, what is it? Because maybe not everyone is yet aware of what we're doing and trying to achieve. So in a nutshell, I would say that the Glasgow Declaration is currently the flagship initiative of UN Tourism on climate action. So for us, it represents the let's say, mechanism through which the program of work of this institution, UN Tourism, is rolled out. The good news is that, I mean, behind the fact of having this institutional backing, the good thing is that the Glasgow Declaration is a participatory initiative. So it's an initiative that seeks to trigger collective impact and for our sector, and so as to contribute to the goals of the Paris Agreement. And normally, we like to refer to it as an action framework or a coordinated plan to accelerate climate action in tourism. And I guess, in fact, to date, this is the only framework addressing tourism stakeholders directly, calling for urgent action to address the climate emergency. Just briefly to outline how it operates, it is a voluntary commitment, so it is non-binding. And those stakeholders that subscribe the declaration basically have to do 5 things or commit to delivering on 5 commitments. The first one is to support the global goals of the Paris Agreement. So, well, you know that basically the science tells us that we need to cut emissions globally by more or less half by 2030 and achieve net zero by 2050. So signatories commit to support that global goal. They commit to develop climate action plans, to structure how they are planning to support the global goal and to implement the plans, obviously, and to align the plans with 5 pathways, strategic pathways, which are measure, decarbonize, regenerate, collaborate, and finance. Then they also commit to report publicly on how they are implementing the commitments, and obviously to work on a collaborative spirit, which is something easy to say, but sometimes not so easy to implement. So, I mean, you can imagine these commitments are quite broad, but they were created to be applicable to all kinds of stakeholders. They are obviously nuances on how different types of stakeholders would implement them. For example, we look at a government, we will be talking about policy. We look at a business such as a hotel. We would be looking at changing the way we operate. At present, we have more or less 848, to be precise, signatories, and they are mainly from private sector, 60%. Then there are also civil society organizations, what we call supporting organizations, such as yourself, that's 30%. And then we have 10% of destinations, which includes subnational destinations and also national level. And we're definitely trying to increase the number of destinations. I have to say, we already also underwent the first due diligence of compliance, where signatories which joined at the time of the launch in November 2021, but were inactive by the end of 2023, meaning they didn't deliver a plan, they didn't report, well, they were withdrawn from the network. That was about 60 entities. And therefore, while the declaration is not non-binding and the commitments I just presented are voluntary, we do try to push for some accountability and at the same time accompany stakeholders in the best way we can to implement the commitments with the development of resources, online sessions and other activities. And obviously, it's key for us to collaborate with supporting organizations like the Long Run to facilitate opportunities for stakeholders to come together, speak about climate action, get trained, and we also collaborate with implementing partners, for instance, the Travel Foundation. So when we launched the declaration back in November 2021, the so-called drafting committee, which basically consisted of Jeremy Sampson from the Travel Foundation, Jeremy Smith here with us today, at the time Tourism Declares, colleagues from Visit Scotland, UNEP, myself from UN Tourism, we were still undergoing the pandemic. And somehow that dark period of no tourism seemed for us as an opportunity to activate the sector to address the climate emergency in a more, let's say, consistent and serious manner. We were having the hope to create something that would allow us to aggregate our efforts to trigger positive impact and, well, progressively transform tourism operations so as to keep the very much needed balance of economic activities with planetary limits. Since those initial discussions, a lot has happened, a lot has been achieved. So first we launched the declaration at COP26 in Glasgow in November 2021. Then it got endorsed by UN Tourism Executive Council in June 2022. Then we pushed for positioning it in a number of high-level UN documents that I'm not going to list because it could be too much. And more recently, last November, we achieved the recognition from UNFCCC, so UN Climate Change Organization, for the Glasgow Declaration as a global climate action initiative. I assume all this sounds very political and high-level diplomacy with possible little imminent effect on the real status quo of the sector. And I don't blame you, but political changes take time, and well, we certainly need to speed up. So there's a little bit of a clash of velocities there, but yeah, and we need to speed up certainly even more now that COVID recovery is achieved and tourism numbers are rising up, with obviously emissions also rising up in parallel. So I just wanted to take a final moment to reiterate the importance of addressing climate action from our standpoint, UN Tourism top down, from the UN system, and obviously also bottom up by bringing as many stakeholders on board as we can, to connect international policy with reality on the ground, or at least try. If we are able to, put to good use the legitimacy and the recognition that climate action efforts in our sector are gaining in international policy, we should be able to unlock support, which is very much needed. And at the same time, we're somehow setting beacons to guide the future development of the sector. And on that top-down approach, and to finish, I promise, I just wanted to close with announcing our last achievement, which is something that we have achieved only because the Glasgow Declaration exists, and it's making progress thanks to its signatories. So thanks to you, the long run, and thanks to all of you out there connected that are also signatories. And the announcement is that this year's United Nations Climate Change Conference of the Parties, the so-called COP29, which will take place in Baku in November, has included for the first time in history tourism in its action agenda. So after 48 COPs without tourism, we're finally having tourism officially in the program. The support of State Tourism Agency from Azerbaijan has been really instrumental to achieve this, and we will be having celebrations on 20th of November in Baku. So you are all, of course, invited to come and join us. Please don't hesitate to make a sign if you wish to come. And perhaps we could think of the celebrations as a good time to also welcome on board more of the long run members as signatories of Glasgow. And then the very last element is the outcome document of COP29 for tourism. So for the first time after these celebrations, which are great, obviously, there will be a COP declaration on enhanced climate action in tourism, which is addressing governments, it's addressing, the UN system, international financial institutions, and it's calling for tourism policies to support national climate goals. So that would be endorsed, and again, is the first time outcome document from a COP29 on tourism. So again, thanks to all of you working on climate action for this collective achievement, which wouldn't be possible with your efforts. I stop here, Holly. I look forward to continuing the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Virginia, for that. And I think, well, first of all, it's really nice. I know that it's been a lot of work, but it's really exciting to have that day at COP. I think that everyone who's been trying to drive the sustainability agenda within tourism, whatever your opinions of COP, whatever your skepticism about what the outcomes can be, I think we can see that definitely as an achievement, that kind of the power of collaboration and having all kind of worked together and signed the Glasgow Declaration has kind of put that on the map and put tourism on the agenda at COP, which is great. I also think it's great timing with more and more destinations coming forward and actually putting climate into their destination planning on the back of kind of emergency response to various natural disasters or, squeeze on resources at a destination level. So that's really exciting. And then finally, I just wanted to say that, for everyone listening, that if you are committed to driving change within the tourism sector, becoming a signatory is really important. Lots of people do say, it's just signing a piece of paper. How can it make a difference? But I think that those signatures we have so far are an indication of how much players within the sector want to see change. And that alone is important to all get together behind. So I'm going to say thank you so much for that intro. So Jeremy, I'm going to turn to you. So you have been involved in co-authoring the declaration and also reporting on its progress. So I feel like there's no one else who knows the climate action plans out there in the tourism industry better than you. But first of all, I thought, could you just tell us in as succinct a way as possible, why are we talking about climate action planning?
Hi, Holly. Thank you for inviting me and thank you for the kind words. As succinctly as possible. We need to decarbonize. And we've known this for some years now, but we are simply not decarbonizing at the speed necessary. And the less climate action we put in now and in the past, the more climate action we have to put in the future. We're currently globally at about 1.2 degrees of warming above industrial levels. All the changes we are all experiencing in our daily lives, all the wildfires, all the floods, all the hurricanes, all of these things are at 1.2 degrees. The target for decarbonizing, Paris Accord and so on, is to keep within 1.5. That's becoming increasingly unlikely. According to UNEP's most recent emissions gap report, if we are to stay within 1.5 degrees of warming, we're going to need, excuse for the dog barking next to me, we're going to need to We're going to need to decarbonize at about 8.7% a year, which is fairly huge. To stay within 2 degrees of warming, which is maybe more likely if less desirable, we still need to cut by 5.3% of emissions globally per year. Now, those don't sound like particularly huge numbers. During COVID, which we all are trying not to remember, but we all should remember, when there was no travel around the world and there was a huge shutdown, emissions reduced by 4.7%. So the challenge is enormous and growing. And then if we think of our own industry, we're responsible for around 10% of global emissions, and that percentage is increasing. Compare that to the EU, responsible for 6% of global emissions as a group of nations. The US, 11%. The entire global food system, 12%. Tourism is responsible and needs to engage. And yet, for the vast majority of people in the world, we are seen as some sort of luxury, as something that is nice to have for a little period of time each year. And we see protests, whatever you want to, all across the world, we see protests at the growth in tourism. And if we think the protests are what they are now, then the reason we need climate action as an industry is, of course, because we need to decarbonize the world. But if we're not seen to play our part as a 10% of global emissions, we are increasingly going to lose our social license. That's the main reason. An additional reason, which is that the world is changing. The world has changed. And whatever we do to decarbonize, climate action is also climate adaptation. It is also changing the way we operate in the face of changing conditions. The world, the ecosystems, the communities that tourism connects to and relies upon suffer enormously from the climate emergency. Coral reefs, glaciers, cities too hot to go outside in, wildfires here where I live in the Mediterranean. We need to change the way we operate in the context of the world that we now live in. So this is why we are talking about climate action.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jeremy. That was very succinct for a big topic and motivational, hopefully. So having read all those climate action plans and kind of reviewed the progress within the industry, it would be great to hear from you kind of, in terms of tourism and what you've seen, what's going well in climate action, and what are we lacking? Are there any kind of big areas that you could put in those 2 pots?
Of course. And I'll do it succinctly, let's hope. But let's focus primarily on the progress. 5 years ago, when we started Tourism Declares, 4 years ago, when we got together with Virginia to develop the Glasgow Declaration, there were no climate action plans in tourism. There was pieces of action happening here and there. There was an awful lot of focus on the idea that offsetting our actions would be what we needed to do. There was very little appreciation of the need for serious climate action, or the idea that we should be doing this not in competition with each other, but in collaboration. That's changed. That really has changed. And you now have, as Virginia said, 848 signatories to the Glasgow Declaration, and probably close on 300 published climate action plans, which is a significant number of plans, meaning a different organization, whether it is a national tourism ministry, a regional tourism destination management organization, a city, a group of hotels, a membership organization like the Long Run, a tour operator, all the many different parts of our industry have sat down as an organization and worked out what it would mean for them to strategically rethink the way they operated in the context of what I was saying in my previous answer. And because they're all doing it inside of the loose framework that Virginia outlined, deliberately loose, one that is flexible to enable collaboration, enable the different contexts in which we all work, but still providing collaboration and alignment, what we see is a gathering of best practice, a gathering of insights, a gathering of understanding what the challenges are, that means that where before we were all operating in exclusion without collaboration, we are now beginning more and more to come together. And that for me is the hope, is that when we work together, we move faster and we move in a better direction. What is lacking in terms of your question? I mean, is the broad appreciation of the scale of change and transformation, the systems change that this is actually going to take. This isn't sticking a solar panel on a sun lounger. This is actually changing our industry and the way we operate. And what Virginia was outlining there that may come through COP, that policy shift, is what we need, what we're lacking. It's brilliant that we've got all these brilliant stories happening. What we now need to have is that policy shift, that moving away of investment, away from extraction, the subsidies moving away from supporting the most damaging forms of industry, of which tourism is one, towards supporting the new ways of operating. It shouldn't be cheaper and easier to fly than to get to a place that you can get to by train. And so in the end, that's the challenge, is that we do need to acknowledge that we need systems change. We need to move away from, a industry based on competition, extraction and profit to one based on cooperation, regeneration and justice.
Yeah, that's great. And actually, it's really nice because it echoes quite a lot of what we've been talking about already today. The long run members are like small players within the tourism industry, but you could see that in lots of their presentations this morning, system change came up over and over again. Like they wanted to embed this holistic thinking into everything that they did and try and influence people around them to do the same. So yeah, it's great to hear that that might be a possibility on a much bigger scale. And Jeremy, I think, would you say that I guess that's why some destinations have almost found it easier to get further in climate action, because they can take that more like top-down approach and embed that holistic thinking if they want to?
I don't know that they've found it easier. I think they found it more unavoidable, that, the destinations don't get to move. Visit San Francisco is always going to be based in San Francisco, and it's going to have the conditions that San Francisco faces, whatever it happens to be. And therefore, they are acutely aware, because they live there, they've lived there all their lives, they work there, what the changes are. They feel intimately related with the community. And therefore, I think that motivation to rethink tourism, when you're feeling it daily, feeling the conditions changing daily, is what has made some certain destinations really put some really leadership in there.
Yeah. So obviously when we talk about these climate action plans, a huge part of planning, which is a lot of our conversation has been today, has been around the role of measurement and reporting. And Jeremy, what you're describing is this need for, rather than we keep taking these little chunks of measurement and reporting out of what we're doing, is maybe we need to rethink kind of what and how we're reporting the whole, like what are the measures we're trying to capture within tourism. But Willie, I thought, as someone who's done a lot of research around the role of reporting from quite an academic perspective, I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about what role it can play in driving action, whether it does drive it, and what we can learn from what we're seeing in the industry already.
Right. So I just want to make sure you can see me and you can see the PowerPoint. I have a short PowerPoint. I know you probably had a lot of PowerPoints today, but is that you can see that properly, right?
Yeah, all good. Thanks.
So thanks very much, Virginia and Jeremy. I mean, it's so great to listen. Actually, I think I'd prefer to be an attendee than a speaker here. I always remember those signs of young people on the street: system change, not climate change. And I think maybe this is finally coming around to our sector. I'm not so sure, but anyways, the state of reporting. So if we go back to from the academic side, if we go back to John Elkington's book Cannibals with Forks, where he discusses triple bottom line, so people, planet, profit. Since then, we've seen this massive increase in corporate social responsibility reports, really. In 2018, Elkington wrote a book, an article in the Harvard Business Review, 25 years after the first mention of the triple bottom line. And he argued for a recall on this triple bottom line because he said that at the end of the day, success or failure on sustainability goals cannot be measured only in terms of profit and loss, right? It has to be measured in terms of well-being of billions of people. And that's what Jeremy was also saying in terms of the social component of tourism. So it's the health of the planet, it's the well-being of the people, and that's just much beyond the profit and loss. So yeah, the idea here is that I'll do a quick, and I'll try to keep this really short as well with this presentation. So over time, the way we measure social environmental impact is in fact increasingly more rigorous when you think about it. And maybe the tech companies are just helping it, the consultant are also perhaps helping it, the regulators as well. It's getting more accurate, but there are still plenty of gaps. We are starting to see some standardization and some acceptance of key metrics that's growing as well. Generally speaking, not necessarily within the tourism and hospitality sector. The first set of talks around global accepted metrics in terms of environmental impact, social impact, and what to measure and how to measure it and how to report it, this is being discussed now. And I'll come back to this in a minute. So if I just go into this, if you look at the number of companies that are filing sustainability reporting, I'm not talking about hospitality or tourism per se. This has been actually there's a report that just came out here by a colleague of mine about hospitality reporting, corporate reporting, and this has been actually relatively stable now last few years. But generally speaking, if you like the last 20 years, we've seen an increase 100-folds of reporting. And in that same time, and this is what Jeremy was saying, 20 years, if you look at the carbon emissions, it's continued to rise. And I don't even touch on all the other impacts here when we look at biodiversity loss or ocean acidification. Anything that has to do with a great acceleration is a curve straight up. So the only way to look at this here is that this increase in corporate reporting on social environmental performance hasn't really curbed anything so far. And the question is whether we're confusing the output of reporting with the impact mitigation, really. So it's and there's a great article actually from a guy called Kenneth Tucker. He's from the Tuck School of Business. And I quote here, and he says, it turns out that reporting is just not a proxy for progress, right? We still largely struggle with measurements in any case, maybe because it's manually checked and recorded, and perhaps it's incomplete or imprecise, it's misleading. And as I said, regulations, initiative, and standardizations are good, and we will see progress. The question that could be raised is how much resources as a business do we actually put in reporting? And is that the best way to use those resources? I am not so sure. I mean, if we've just said now we need to have, and the curve is really steep, we're talking about 8% per year. So those resources that we spent on reporting, is that the best way for us to use those resources, or should we be looking at actionable activities at this point? So anyways, it's a little bit of a dark picture here, but you know, we could put a however to this. And the however, and this is where the academic comes into this a little bit, the increase in reporting may be hiding something else, in fact, and it's a critical component of deeper change, where the businesses are increasingly held accountable for the impacts, right? Perhaps by the investors that are wanting to put their money into this, maybe the banks, the insurance companies, the corporate clients. So beyond the profit, reporting is helping those businesses perhaps to be accountable. So there was an article that was published in 2022 in a Journal of Environmental Management, and the authors, they looked at the development model that was developed a few years back, which positioned each company's sustainability reporting with multiple worldviews of corporate sustainability. So linking the disclosure approach those companies to the effect on sustainability performance. So for example, a business that comply with reporting guidelines and basic standard disclosure but with a very business-centered approach, so focusing on my results rather than a stakeholder approach. The result of this, which is a do less bad approach to sustainability, really translate into actually a weak sustainability performance. That was the output of the authors. The authors employed sort of a computer-based textual analysis on a sample of UK firms that published sustainability reports for a series of years they looked at. And basically, business that have integrated triple bottom line approach may do a little better. And the businesses that are really integrating this sort of, they call it repair approach, slowly it's getting into that regenerative, so repair, more qualitative development, show a much stronger to very strong performance. So what does that suggest? It suggests that businesses should change their approach towards sustainability reporting and shift from the business case approach to sustainability reporting and move to the next stage, which arguably is also being demanded heavily by the regulators now, to understand things such as double materiality. That is, how do I impact the world around me and how am I being impacted? Perhaps this is also a way out of just looking at my own business, but looking at how do I impact the others as well. So colleagues that conduct hospitality and tourism research have published an article that said that also, and I can share the details on sustainability reporting of large hotel companies. And the situation is similar. Reporting is evolving. We see more of us that stakeholder logic. So that's something that has changed, which means we see some more transparency, a greater compliance, and it's partly because, let's face it, much of the reporting is being increasingly regulated. And then the next question that I would have is, ultimately, who reads those reports? And why would you want to read them? And as I said, so much resources is invested, but for what? So sure, the regulators may want them if you're large companies, but who else? Well, I mean, at the end of the day, perhaps it is the finance people that, or the banking industry, that's going to want to see whether you understand your risks and what sort of impact do you have, etc. But I'm just wondering whether we're missing an opportunity to activate change actually through that reporting, right? So I don't get bogged down too much on what you're about to see here on the slide. And again, Holly, please make sure if anyone is interested, you can pass these slides. I only have one more slide and that's it. Don't get bogged down on the terminology behind the various type of reports. I was just trying to, there's a variety of non-regulated versus non-regulated marketing-driven types of report to a more quantitative regulated type of report. We have a little bit of everything in here. The CSR reports are usually sort of a non-regulated, nice story type of report. ESG reporting is becoming something all different altogether because it's highly regulated. So the question is there something missing out of this report? And there's an interesting opinion piece actually that came out just 2 days ago from Jonathan Foley at Project Drawdown, which is an amazing set of solutions. And he asked, what's missing from most climate reporting? And he argued that actually stories of people taking actions to address climate change that are largely absent in the meantime. And why does he say that? He says, well, because those stories, they offer hope and inspiration for others to take up the challenges and create that positive change in their lives and their communities. So stories in a report are not going to impress the regulators. They don't want them. They're probably not going to impress the investors either. But if we hope to change across the board and replicating and scaling solutions, stories are a great way. I'm not sure they have necessarily a place in the traditional reporting. The more we evolve in the reporting, the more it becomes quantitative, number-driven, which is also a consequence of that greater regulatory oversight. The US Security Exchange Commission's rules have done that to enhance what a company should be doing in climate-related disclosure. In the EU, for large businesses, we have the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And then this is, we're looking at over 1,000 data points here to enter for the large businesses. So, I mean, it's massive. But arguably, we need that qualitative parts. What works, what does not work. And coincidentally, the long run impact report 2023 features actually such stories from the members. And too often the wheel is being reinvented where solutions somewhere have been tested, implemented successfully. So, I mean, just to finish, just to keep it short, yeah, nothing flashy really in terms of what would I do if I'd have to kickstart. So, you know, no bells and whistles. It's just 5 tips, I think, to get started on reporting, which is form a reporting team really. So get your support from for your reporting activities. Have a green team. Perhaps you probably have it already. Then start a reporting group within that group, a team you know would enjoy gathering information around sustainability. What have we done so far? What are we planning to do? Can we record this? Compile that documentation. What exists already? You might have some sustainability policy statement already. You might have a responsible purchasing policy. You might have some guidelines. Get those documents. You may have tracked energy consumption in the past. Compile what's out there and then develop whatever is not there. And then I've added choose a reporting software, possibly. I think if you're serious about tracking, reporting some of the key metrics on energy emission, any resource usage, software will make your life easier because, and it's linked a little bit to the previous slide here. If you look at reporting and disclosing specific data points in your business, having a software you'll save time, you'll have a good data collection, you'll be able to analyze this data, it's less error prone, etc. So I think this probably makes sense. And then you have to do the work, which is to establish a baseline year and then start from there, set your target, gather data, and so on. So I mean, none of this is really rocket science. It's also not brain medicine. It's basic management at the end of the day, which everyone that works in or lead a business can do and should do it today. And perhaps the task around reporting will help you and perhaps help to encourage the team to cultivate climate or that sustainability hope and share the outcome with the others. Because at the end of the day, and this is perhaps where you want to be, is hope inspires action, actually. And as Jeremy just said, I think it's very, very easy and tempting to just put your hands down and to say, it's just too much, but it isn't an option. And I think it can be so enriching actually to have good stories and to do well. So anyways, that's my few thoughts here. I'll stop sharing.
Brilliant. Thank you, Willie. As always, not really just a few thoughts, but actually very well thought through and put together and evidence-based, which is why it's great to chat to academics sometimes. So thank you for that. But I thought, you know, what really stands out for me in that, thinking about smaller businesses that might be on this call, particularly thinking, you know, long run members, those types of businesses, that really one thing to remember is that it's that losing sight of why we're reporting that seems to cause this problem. It's really easy to fall into a trap of kind of just thinking, oh, well, we measured that last year and we were told that we can't really do any climate action before we start measuring, so we'll just measure it again this year. And actually this whole reporting and measurement and action process is like a continually evolving context. The context within the world changes, the context for us locally changes, and the context within our sector, I believe, is going to change very, very quickly. So I think having that as a guiding principle of like, why are we measuring, why are we reporting, what do we want the output to be?
There's one more thing, if I may add, because I didn't put it in the slides, but I think it's so critical and we don't have that very well in our sector, is we don't have good benchmark data. This is a real problem, actually. I have friends that are auditors, environmental auditors of hotels, and they go to those hotels and they look at the data and they see water consumption way off the track. And they say, how can it be you have such a water consumption on a per guest night? And then the chief engineer will say, yeah, but if you look at our data last year, it was exactly the same. And so, yes, it is constantly bad. Every year, it's way off the chart. They just don't know because there's no benchmarking happening, because we don't have data across the board in that region or within that geography or that type of hotel that would say this water consumption is way out of line compared to your peers. What needs to happen? This is still a big problem, especially for SMEs. And that's the job of, I think, that's the job of regional hotel associations, the DMOs, to actually convince these owners to share the data so we can build a simple database and share it to everyone, say, guys, this is what it looks like. Best of class, worst of class, where do we go? How much are the investments? We can do this.
Yeah.
And that's really a good job that needs to be done.
Yes, definitely. And when I was looking at your kind of why are we looking at kind of by kind of individually, why aren't we looking at by specific target? So your biodiversity target, your carbon target. And then I felt like, oh, that quite naturally would work for the Glasgow Declaration's pathways, and having a baseline for each of those would be pretty cool. But Jeremy, I was going to ask kind of, you know, it's pretty daunting, all of this for businesses to get started. I wondered if you could give us a bit of inspiration, like who's getting this balance right between kind of action and reporting, and what would be your kind of words of encouragement or tips for people online who might be thinking, where do I start? I want to do something.
Thank you. I love hearing someone talk about an academic talking about reporting and talk about storytelling. I mean, it's just brilliant, and it's just wonderful to sort of see that, because I mean, I've sort of based my working career on wanting to share stories to motivate action from people, and see something brilliant that someone's doing and make sure someone else hears about it so they can benefit from it. It's really what has been the privilege and the thing that's inspired me most in the last couple of years since those plans have come through. It's not sitting and checking the data on whether they've actually measured correctly. It's sitting and reading what they're doing, hearing the stories, and think, wow, I wish we could tell that story to more people. And there are good examples happening all over. One of the places that it's most happening, and I'm not just saying this because I'm on a long run meeting, is in those small operators who have it in their DNA. People who designed companies because they wanted to use the power of tourism to make the world a better place. Not surprisingly, when they then confront the challenge of the climate emergency, just as when they confront the biodiversity emergency or social justice or health emergency or all those other interconnected challenges, they're well placed to it because they're structurally designed for it. There's been a lot of really great work coming out of a lot of membership organizations. And again, I know, talking to the long run, it's a membership organization, so I'm not just going to highlight the long run. But a lot of really great European membership organizations, and then others across the Caribbean and South Pacific, where I think they are getting people, the members are going to the leadership and saying, we don't know what to do, help us. And because the role of a membership organization is to support its members' needs and interests, they're going out and doing the work to build those collaborative support systems for their members. And again, doing it through Glasgow, and therefore building an ever more connected ecosystem. Because we are getting more and more of this happening, there's definitely increasing amount of good work happening from, let's loosely call them suppliers, those people who provide the tools, the frameworks, the measurement facilities, whatever it might be, the programmatic stuff that makes it possible. Because no one's going to build something if no one's going to use it. But now we're beginning to have people saying we need something, people saying I'm trying to do it. So you're now seeing ever more sophisticated consultants and platforms and so on delivering the tools that support people. And then I felt finally, as we said previously, the destinations who are doing the great work all around. And that comes, as you said at the very beginning, Virginia, it was Visit Scotland, who was one of the co-authors of the declaration in the first place. Great work happening in the Netherlands, in Spanish regions, in Chile, and across all across the world. A lot of stuff happening in the South Pacific and the Caribbean. And I can't, it's people I work with very closely, but I'm incredibly impressed by the work that Finland has been doing. I mean, Finland, when they signed the Glasgow Declaration a couple of years ago, signed it, bringing in 63 members, private sector stakeholders and regional destinations from inside of the country to sign all at the same time. Started as a collaborative thing. And now if you look at the work going on in the country, what you see is you have a national framework, national tools, national program, national set of indicators, all aligned with the necessary European measurement, and then initiatives happening throughout the country at different tiers and different levels, all coming together and collaborating. And if we can see that model and see it replicate and see the international alignment, which we are seeing, that is how we begin to accelerate and build. You also, another question, which was what would I say to people who were feeling overwhelmed? Well done. That's exactly the correct emotion. If you're not feeling overwhelmed, I don't think you're paying attention. And it is incredibly daunting and horrendous. And I feel overwhelmed most Mondays. And I continue to do so. The trouble is, I'm not trying to be flip. Overwhelming then paralyzes, and we don't do anything because we've realized it's begun to sunk in the totality of what we have to do, and that's too much. But I remember a couple of years ago, I had a conversation with someone who asked me the same question, and they said, we don't know what to do. And I said, well, have you ever had a meeting in your company where you dedicated that meeting to talking about climate action or to climate change? And they're like, no. It's normally in the sort of things AOB, 5 minutes to discuss the climate emergency. And I said, well, call a meeting, invite the company, sit down and say, we've set aside an hour, whatever it might be, and we're going to talk about climate. I don't know what it will turn into, but prioritizing it would be a good place to start.
Yeah, I love that, and having it as a kind of topic discussion where everyone, because whatever organization you're in, all your employees are going to bring very different perspectives from that, which could make you start from a much more interesting starting point than if you've kind of read a load of reports of what someone else has done. Maybe you need to start closer to home. So thanks for that, Jeremy. We've got loads of questions, so I'm just going to start kind of picking some of them off, and just jump in. Don't be polite, because we haven't got much time. So one of them is around the UN tourism webpage being a bit out of date. So Virginia, I'm just going to leave that with you. I don't think you need to answer that. There's one around, so how can tourism reduce its impact when flights are often cheaper than train travel? Generally media not necessarily acting that responsibly. That's from Gary. I think maybe the overwhelm feel, but what are we going to do about this flights conundrum? Someone answer it briefly.
Polly, may I jump in on the first question, because I really would like to answer that
You
one.
want to defend yourself.
Thanks for the question. And basically, it is great that you point out this report, because this report, which, yes, was published in 2019, is still a very relevant piece, in the sense that it was the first time that UN Tourism, in collaboration with the OECD, in particular the International Transport Forum, that's the ITF acronym there, was forecasting where are we headed if we continue in a business as usual scenario as a sector. And that data the report published in 2019 used data of 2010. Imagine, because there's no data available going back to how great it would be to benchmark. When you look at data from countries, public sector data is really lagging behind. So with data from 2010 publishing in 2019, emissions were forecasted, and the report said that we were going to increase by 25 by 2030 from 2016 levels. In the beginning of my presentation, and also Jeremy reiterated it, we mentioned what the Paris Agreement requires to keep track with 1.5 degrees Celsius global warming maximum. Science tells us we need to cut emissions in half by 2030. You can imagine we will not even cut them. We will increase them by 25%. So that report is really a key, because it sets all the alarms at an institutional level like never before, and is at the root of all the discussions of the Glasgow Declaration. Now, I can see the irony, why calling it latest might be a bit shocking, but it's still the latest. So if anyone wants to join forces to update it, Dale Honeck, as a former employee, you're very much welcome to jump on board, and so we can do it together. But yeah, all of you, is not outdated. You want to check it out. It's still interesting in what it says. Pretty scary, I have to say. So thanks.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you for that. Thanks for that clarity. Sorry, I slightly rushed over it, and I'm great. It's great to hear we've got an action going forward. Dale is going to donate all of his time to helping you updating that on the back of this call. So that's great. So yeah, what about kind of, I suppose, speaking from maybe the perspective of a small tour operator, this problem around flights and being so much cheaper than rail travel, the media not catching up quick enough. I mean, my brief answer to that is that we need to think of ourselves as campaigners. Like anyone in the tourism industry that wants to drive sustainability, get your campaigning hat on and keep pushing, because it is changing slowly and surely. But Jeremy, any answers to that of what tour operators can do?
That's such a huge question for a short answer. Tour operators, depending on where they operate, should keep on designing absolutely brilliant trips that operate from day one to day whatever as sustainably and regeneratively and as equitably as possible, and inspire people in the experiences that they have. Where they can market those tours to people who live nearer them, that is a good thing, because the shorter the flight, the less emitting, the less pollution it's going to cause. I realize that isn't necessarily always the case, and certainly if one is operating trips on islands and in areas in Southern Africa and Eastern Africa and Western Africa and wherever else. But the vast majority of the emissions from flying do not come from people flying to Africa. They come from people flying in between Europe and back and forth to the States, and they're between some major key economies. And that is, and I saw there was another question related to justice in there, and I would tie the two in there, which is that we have, when rethinking how we deliver tourism climate action, to put it in the frame of what is justice. How do we ensure that our work to decarbonize supports the most vulnerable rather than making them pay the cost of the changes we make? And I do not have the answer to that, but I know that is the question we should be asking.
But there is quite a recent report out about which might be worth people seeing.
There is indeed quite a recent report. Yeah, I was one of the co-authors of it, so I think that's probably the one you're talking about. I should definitely be mentioning that. Thank you very much indeed. The Travel Foundation recently published a report on climate justice in tourism that was led by a wonderful Cherokee scholar, Bobby, and she and I worked together. Sorry, I've got this dog distracting me enormously. Bobby Chu Bigby and also Freya Higgins de Boyle. The three of us wrote the piece, but we spoke with an awful lot of experts from around the world, and not just experts in terms of the Willy type of expert, but experts in terms of those who are people who lived experience from living in indigenous communities and vulnerable places around the world. And so I'm now being jumped on by the dog, which is making it all the more challenging. It's not even my dog. I'm looking after it for someone else, for someone else. And yeah, it's free to download, Climate Justice in Tourism from the Travel Foundation. There's very little point in me spending the rest of this thing talking about it. What I would say is go and read it. It talks about the need for us to center climate justice and vulnerable communities at the heart of all of our work.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much, Cecilia, and thanks for flagging that as well.
If I may add just a brief reflection, Holly, on Gary's question, it also goes back to things we have mentioned in the beginning, and it is policies. At the end of the day, somehow I have the feeling that we tend to blame maybe too much the consumer. And don't get me wrong, changing consumer behavior is fundamental, and the drive, let's say the demand for different experiences is really something not to take for granted. It can really be super powerful to trigger the systemic shift that we're looking for. But to be honest, more and more I reflect about it, I think the experiences need to become sustainable by default. And for transport to become sustainable by default, when we're looking at aviation, it's we are limiting the options, and regulation gains more weight. So at the end of the day, governments would need to revisit the way they develop policy instruments and subsidies, and rationalizing the way long haul and flights is distributed would be fundamental. Destinations that are far away should not be hampered because of people not flying when their tourism sector depends on flying. But as Jeremy said, maybe in Europe, where there are other options for transport, there it should be really important to make the shift as fast as possible.
Maybe you'll have a chance one day to bring up the topic of a personal carbon travel budget, especially for leisure travelers, which really it is a luxury. And so therefore, maybe we have lots of paper on the topic, and I know it's not popular because it puts the emphasis on the individual rather than the companies, but nevertheless, there is something there. We all work with budget. I mean, there's only so many parts per million of CO2 left until 1.5, until 2. It's all there. And so, right, maybe there is something there which is not popular, but it's called a personal travel carbon budget.
Yeah, thanks for that, Willie. We've got lots of questions on kind of the more technical side of reporting, recommending reporting software, relevance of the MST initiative. So we're out of time now. So I just want to say thank you so much for all these questions. We're gonna write them all down, and we're gonna try and get answers to everyone who's asked them. So if you've asked a question that hasn't been answered, can you please drop your email in the chat so that we can get back to you? I feel like we can have lots of spin-offs from this conversation. There's definitely a whole conversation about climate justice. It sounds like there's a whole conversation around different reporting software and methods. And as always, there's a conversation between the tension between flying long haul to support crucial community and conservation projects versus staying closer to home, and what should we do as the industry to kind of address that conundrum. So thanks, Annemiek, for flagging that one.
Holly, is it possible? I know we don't have time to talk to the questions, but those questions are really, really good. Is there a way that we can actually have a copy of those questions as well?
Yes, we are going to write them all down, and we're going to make sure that the panelists all get them, and then any of you can answer them, then yeah, we'll do that.
Thank you.
So that's the end of the panel session. Thank you so much, Jeremy, Willie, and Virginia. Thank you everyone for listening and for your questions. And I'm going to hand over to Ruth, who's going to guide us through some inspiring presentations from our Southern Africa members.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, yes.